In this video, we will show you how to replace your vehicle's front CV axle assembly on this Ford F-150. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. We're going to have to make our way into the engine compartment just above where our wheel well is so we can gain access to our ABS wire connector. Now on the driver's side, if you are making your way down along the air filter housing, the closest wire connector is the ABS wire connector here. Now on this connector, you should find that you have a red locking tab that we need to carefully pull out and away, and then we can squeeze on the tab that's located behind it to unlock this and separate it. It can be difficult to take hold of this with your hands, so I'm just going to use a small prying device. We'll pull that red tab out and away. And now I'm going to squeeze on that tab and we'll try to separate this. Once you have it disconnected, a quick inspection of both ends to confirm there's no corrosion, and we can continue on. Continuing on, we're going to remove the wheel by removing all 6 of our 21mm lug nuts, and we can get this off of here. Now that we have the wheel off, let's pay attention directly in the center of the wheel bearing hub here. You're going to find an axle nut cover. We have to remove this cover. I'm going to be using some pliers for this. Go ahead and take hold of that. We'll give it a wiggle, rock it back and forth, and pull it out and away. Once you have that off of there, a quick inspection to make sure it's not rotted or damaged in some way. You will be reusing this. We'll set it aside. Behind that area, you're going to find a 15mm headed mounting nut. Let's remove that. After applying penetrant in this area, we'll continue on with a hammer and punch. The punch is going to go directly in the center of your axle shaft. We'll go ahead and lightly tap on this, separating it from the wheel bearing located behind it. Now, once you have movement from this area, we'll continue on. Now, with the wheel out of the way, we're making our way underneath our forward lower control arm. In this area, you're going to find the shaft for your front sway bar link, making its way down and through the control arm. The rest of it's up above, leading to your sway bar. We'll remove our 18mm headed mounting nut down along the bottom area here. When loosening this, you may find that the entire stud wants to spin on you. If that's the case, we'll be using an 18mm to hold on the mounting nut itself and an 8mm down on the shaft of the sway bar link. At that point, you can either turn the shaft of the sway bar link clockwise to start removing it while holding the nut, or you can turn the nut counterclockwise while holding the stud. Now we have movement from that sway bar link. Let's continue forward on the lower control arm, still remaining underneath it. We'll continue on to our 2 18mm headed mounting nuts, holding the front shock assembly to that lower control arm. Now let's pay attention to where the ABS connects onto the strut tower, up inside this area, just behind the fender liner. We'll have to dislodge this. We need to create some slack here. I'm using a trim tool. You can use pretty much anything as a prying device. Now we're making our way down to where the ABS wire makes its way onto this flex hose bracket. Keep following that ABS wire. We have a plastic holder for that ABS wire on the flex hose itself. Now we have an 8mm headed mounting bolt here holding the ABS wire to our knuckle. Quick inspection of that cable, looks good. In that same area, we have a 10mm headed mounting bolt holding the flex hose bracket to that front steering knuckle. We'll remove this. Before we start removing our caliper, it's going to be a little bit easier to gain access to our 2 mounting bolts if you can pivot this from side to side. So we'll make our way over to the front outer tie rod end. As for removing the outer tie rod end, if your mounting nut has a cotter pin, you want to go ahead and remove that. We'll be replacing it. Use a 21mm to remove that mounting nut. A quick inspection of that. The next thing we'll do is start this on upside down. We'll make sure it's level with the stud of the tie rod end, and we'll start lightly tapping on this area, breaking it free from the steering knuckle. Just check that mounting nut, no damage. Remove the tie rod, a quick inspection of that as well. Now we can pivot this as necessary. Let's start having a look along the backside where you can see the caliper and your front axle. Looking just above the axle, you're going to find two vacuum hoses leading to your four-wheel drive actuator. We can go ahead and disconnect those. Typically they just slide up and out of place. If you do have to pry on them, just be careful not to cause any damage. Now once you have those off of there, just a quick inspection to make sure they're both soft and pliable. Not torn, worn, or damaged. Those look good. Now along the back side here, you can see two 21mm headed mounting bolts. We're going to remove the pair. Starting with the upper one, we'll fully remove it, start it back in just a couple threads. If anything looks like it's rotted, weak, or damaged, you do want to replace that. Now as we remove the final mounting bolt here, we're going to make sure we're holding onto that caliper so it does not fall down and potentially cause any damage. When we hang this aside, we'll make sure we put no pressure on our flex hose. When you remove the caliper, just have a quick inspection of the brake pads. You can see those right in this area. If it looks like they're worn at an angle or damaged in any way, you'd want to go ahead and replace them. Now I'm just going to use a small hook here and we'll hang this up and out of the way. Let's remove our brake rotor. Quick inspection, set that aside. Let's go ahead and clean up our mating surface on our wheel bearing hub here. Use some parts cleaner, wire brush, whatever you need. Now we're going to have to safely start raising our front suspension up, so I'm making my way underneath the lower control arm in a safe area to do so. We'll gently start bringing this up, paying attention not to shift the vehicle. You can see this starting to compress. Now we're paying attention to our upper ball joint nut. We can start removing that using an 18mm. We'll take that off of there, a quick inspection, start it back on a couple threads. Continuing from here, we have to separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle. To separate this, you could try using a ball joint separator of some sort. I'm going to lightly tap on this area with a hammer. We don't want to cause any damage, just a little bit of vibration to separate this. Now we'll pull down on the upper control arm. You can do this by hand or use a pry bar if necessary. We'll remove that mounting nut. We can continue on to separating the upper control arm and ball joint from our knuckle, but you want to be careful when this pulls away. You don't want to get hurt. Start lowering this out and away. Now let's release pressure from underneath the lower control arm, essentially lowering the suspension. We'll rest this off to the side. Now that we have the axle dislodged out from the wheel bearing and from that four-wheel drive actuator, we're going to follow it towards the inboard side where it connects to the front differential. We have to pop this free to separate it. We'll continue on with a pry bar. We're going to make our way right up against the inboard side of the axle here, and we're going to carefully press up against the housing of the differential. This shield is in the way, but you don't necessarily have to remove it. It's just going to press right up against there. Let's go ahead and pop this free. We'll be extremely careful at all times here. If you find you're having a hard time prying it out of place, you can try to use a thin pry bar. Gently make your way in between the differential and the axle, and we'll lightly tap on the end, pushing the two areas apart. To be able to get the axle out of here, we're going to pull down on our front suspension. we'll have to pull the lower portion of the front shock away from the control arm, giving us a little bit of room to remove that axle from the front differential. Now we should be able to swing this off towards the side here, and we can start fully removing that axle. Just go ahead and pull on that. There it is. There it is, friend. Now that we have the axle out of there, we'll just clean and inspect the seal on the differential here, confirming it's still in good usable order. Just use some petroleum jelly right around the seal here. That'll help the axle slide into position. All right, let's get ready to install our brand new axle. We're going to take this and carefully slide it into the front differential, straight on through that seal. Let's be extremely careful not to cause any damage to the seal. Now, as you slide it in, you're going to find it only goes so far before you'll have to start tapping it into the proper position. It has a small locking ring. All right. Now, once you've tapped it in, pay attention along where the axle meets your front differential. They should almost be touching. At this point, I'm going to take hold of the inboard side of the axle, not necessarily the boot, but the area that slides into the differential, and we'll try to tug it out of place. It needs to be locked in. That feels good. Now let's align the lower portion of the lower strut to that lower control arm. We'll pull down on the suspension as necessary. Now we should be able to flex that strut around a little bit here. We'll just go ahead and pivot this over as necessary. As we're bringing this into position, we also need to pay attention to our sway bar link. We want to make sure that's aligned with its proper port on the lower control arm as well. Now we can start getting the outer portion of the axle shaft in and past our four-wheel drive actuator and out through that wheel bearing. There we are. Should all slide together. As we start bringing the axle into the proper position, you're going to find that you have to safely start raising up your front suspension. Once we start bringing it up, we'll continue pressing that axle into the knuckle, and we'll also have to pay attention up at our upper ball joint. You can see that axle shaft poking through the wheel bearing there. Now that we have this aligned and the suspension's up as far as possible, you can tell that the ball joint still needs to make its way down. So I'm just going to use a pry bar up inside this area. We'll rest up against our front strut coil spring and start pulling this down. Pry bar in here. Start bringing this down into position. Continue on with our ball joint nut. For that ball joint nut, you want to start it on, snug it up, torque it to 46 foot-pounds. Now let's pay attention to our wheel bearing hub. We need to add some copper anti-seize to this. After that, we can continue on with installing our brake rotor. Now let's install our brake rotor. Once you have that in place, just continue on with one of your original lug nuts. We're going to hold this rotor in place. We'll continue on with the caliper. Let's get this caliper in place. We're sliding the brake pads over our brake rotor. Continuing on, we'll be paying attention along the back side here. It's time to install our two mounting bolts. I've applied some blue thread locker. For those mounting bolts, go ahead and start them in, snug them up, torque them to 184 foot-pounds. Let's install those vacuum lines onto the hub actuator here. Just line them up, press them on. We'll just give that a little tug, make sure it's properly secured. If it's loose, you can use a wire tie if necessary. Now let's secure our flex hose. That goes in this area right along here. Use our 10mm mounting bolt. Go ahead and start it in, snug it up. Now it's time for our ABS wire. Let's make sure we have it in the proper orientation. We'll have it so it's facing down like this. Continue on with your 8mm headed mounting bolt. Start it in, snug it up. We can continue on securing that ABS wire. It's going to make its way up the flex hose. We're coming up to the bracket now. Press that in there. Now continuing up past here, as you remember during the removal process, it had to go in and behind this brake line. Bring that right up there. Our next mounting point is going to be right up in this area. Just try to get that aligned. There it is. Just double check, make sure that's secured. We'll take the rest of this and put it right up along top here. Let's go ahead and remove support from underneath our lower control arm. It's time for the outer tie rod end. We'll take that tie rod end, slide it down and through the knuckle, start on our mounting nut, snug it up. The torque for this is 85 foot-pounds. Now, once you have that nut torqued, if you have a castle nut, you need to make sure the castle nut slot is properly aligned with the port that makes its way through the tie rod end. If it's not, you need to continue tightening the nut until the very next slot is. After that, continue on with your locking cotter pin. A little further. That looks aligned. Let's press that through and pin it over. Now we're making our way back underneath the lower control arm. It's time to start installing our hardware here. Let's start with the stud for our sway bar link. We'll start on our 18mm mounting nut. Now at this point, we're going to have to start tightening this up, but you may find that the stud of the sway bar link spins on you just as it did when we were trying to remove this. We'll try to get the nut up far enough that we can eventually grab onto the stud and continue tightening after that. There we are. Now that we have this snug, we'll torque it to 46 foot-pounds. Let's start on our lower mounting hardware here. We'll start it on, snug it up, torque that to 66 foot-pounds. Get this lug nut off of here. We'll continue on with our axle nut directly in the center. Go ahead and start that on, bottom it out. The torque for this is 30 foot-pounds. Now typically when I try to torque an axle nut, I'm going to put a pry bar diagonally past the lug studs, being extremely careful not to cause any damage, making its way all the way down to the ground. That'll prevent this from spinning on us while we continue torquing. Still locking nuts, we just need to make our way all the way down. There we are. Remove your bar. Install your protective cover. We'll align this, use a rubber mallet to drive it into place. Double check, make sure that's seated all the way around. Now it's time to install the wheel. We'll get this up in position, start on all the lug nuts. Once they're bottomed out, we'll get the wheel back on the ground and torque them to 150 foot-pounds. We'll be snugging and torquing in a crisscross manner. Get this on the ground. Torqued. Okay, friend, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, you want to go ahead and take it for a road test, listen for any funny noises, get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.